Good afternoon and welcome to the discussion forum on financing REDD+, Closing the Gap, which is being co-hosted by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, and the UN REDD program, which, as you may know, is a collaboration between the UN Environment Program, the UN Development Program, and FAO. My name is Tim Christoffersen. I coordinate the activities of UNEP on forests and climate change and within the UN REDD program. And we're delighted to have a very knowledgeable panel of speakers with us this afternoon who will be helping us to grapple with the challenging yet vital question of the REDD+ finance gap. Now, the first thing I would like to do is somewhat manage expectations by, depending on how you reckon it, the finance gap for REDD+ is anything between $20 and $30 billion a year. So I doubt we will be closing that in a 90-minute event here. But what we would like to do is to make a contribution to the overall debate on REDD+ financing by showing both the importance and the feasibility of scaling up REDD+ finance from a variety of sources. In our debate, there might be some elephants entering the room. Some of them might be there from the very beginning. The issues that might not be solved until the end of next week at the earliest, but we would like to try to do our best to at least name these issues clearly and then discuss what pragmatic solutions we have moving forward. To help us to achieve our overall objective to make a useful contribution to the negotiations, we have asked our panel to consider three key questions, and we'll be touching on them throughout the course of this session. The key questions are: what can realistically be done to narrow the REDD+ finance gap, and what can be done right now? What should the portfolio of funding options look like and why? And how can the risks related to private sector REDD+ engagement be managed? The discussion forum will be split into three parts. We will first hear introductory statements from the panelists, which will be quite short, and then we'll have a moderated question and answer part, and we will open the floor for questions from the audience. We also have a rapporteur with us, and the rapporteur will close the session by reflecting on the main points of our discussions. We have with us on the panel, and I'll be saying a little bit more on each of them as I give them the word. We are very happy to have with us on the panel Dr. Naoko Ishii, who is the CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility, Ambassador Hans Bratska, the Director General and Special Envoy for Climate Change of the Norwegian Ministry of the Environment, Mr. Don Kanak from the Harvard Law School Program on International Financial Systems, and he's also the chairman of Prudential Corporation Asia, Mr. Thierry Novacek is a Product Environment Manager at Airbus, and last but certainly not least, Pakheru Prasetyo, who is a member of the National REDD+ Task Force of the President of Indonesia, and we'll be looking forward to various contributions from these panelists. We do have limited amount of time, so in the beginning there will be a short statement from the panelists. We would like to keep as much time as possible for questions and discussion with the audience. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Naoko Ishii. She has been unanimously appointed at the Council earlier this year in the summer as the fourth CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility, which is the world's leading international institution dedicated to investing in the stewardship and health of the global environment. Previous to her position, she held senior positions in the Japanese Ministry of Finance. She has also worked at the Harvard University's Institute for International Development and has held positions with international institutions both at the policy level and in the field. And we're very happy to have her here. Please, Naoko, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you to UNRED, IUCN, and UNEP for having me for this very important session. I took actually this new position 4 months ago, but it is really scary that knowing that our world, our planet is actually approaching its limit, and many of the important ecosystem is stressed to its tipping point. So I'm really convinced more than ever that the core mission of the GEF is to a champion of global commons. But in order for us to turn around this very uncomfortable situation, we need to find a way to catalyze the transformational change anytime soon. And from that point of view, this forest is such a central stage. It's not only a huge carbon sink, but equally important. It provides a wide range of additional environmental services, and also from development point of view, the forests are so crucial to support the millions of livelihoods. So, and that is why the GEF has been providing quite a significant chunk of resources already for the last 2 years, and the current GEF5 is so good. We have provided over US 425 million through the Sustainable Forest Management and REDD Plus incentive scheme, and it actually leveraged already 3.4 billion US dollars in co-financing. And on this occasion, I'd like to thank Ambassador Blatskar for the leadership taken by the Norwegian government and lifting REDD Plus from the concept stage to a actual, translated into the actual form of measures, so form of the practice. So thank you so much, and for Norway, the government of Norway, for its leadership. But apparently, this level of financing is not enough, and we really need to do more. But more, not only in terms of financing, but in terms of action and the policy action too. And here I wanna have 5 points, very briefly, 5 points to share with you. First of all, we need to consider the forest not only from carbon sink or climate change per se, but to value the all range of services the forest provides. For instance, that one of the reasons why we have this problem of this the global environmental crisis is that we are failing to put prices of the natural capital, or we are failing to value the natural capital to reflect them or integrate them into the day-to-day decision making. So I think it's really important for us to put the prices to evaluate the forest from the carbon point of view, but also to evaluate the all services that the forest provided. So that's the point number one. The second point is that we need much better coordination of the existing financing for forest. So both coordination between the donor and the forest countries, but also among the coordination with other financing schemes. So that's the point number two. Number three is that it's not only financing, but what exactly we could do utilizing those financing. To me, one of the most important thing is how to strengthen the domestic capacity to manage forest. And how to introduce or to strengthen the governance structure and MRV. These are the kind of key conditions actually for forest country to get more financing. So it's a bit of chicken and egg that if you introduce much stronger the governance system and MRV, then maybe the more money could flow. So that's the third point I want to make. The fourth point is that we need to build much more stronger partnership between the public and private sector. It's not only the forest, but it can be other natural capital issue too. But this is the area that's very, very important, particularly from the Jeff point of view, to catalyze the transformational change. So again, how to value the natural capital and how to integrate those value into the day-to-day decision making and both the private sector and the public sector. So that's the number 4. The final point is that, well, I think we should be mindful that the forest really has a longer term span, that somehow our decision making system is maybe too much of the short run, but the forest has a longer term span, it goes beyond decades. So that we also need to be mindful that we put a much longer term span when we think about how to manage forest, and both in terms of policy actions, but also the financing. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Those were 5 very important points, and happy that you also included the public-private partnerships in that. We'll be hearing later from the private sector about this. I'm also lucky that we have a rapporteur who's capturing all these key points. Dr. Jane Feehan from the European Investment Bank will be summarizing the session towards the end. We move now to another champion in the global REDD Plus financing agenda. One could say the champion in that sphere. Although I know that they would be happy to share that leadership with more and other donors. Definitely. But it's clear that that Norway has a very pivotal role in this whole debate. So I'm very happy to introduce Ambassador Hans Bratska, Director General and Special Envoy for Climate Change. From 2008 to 2011, he was director of the Government of Norway's Climate and Forest Initiative. Hans Bratska holds PhD in political science and has extensive experience in international relations. He was, amongst others, Norway's ambassador to Sri Lanka, which, by the way, is a UN REDD partner country, so he also knows these issues from the perspective of the country. Please, Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to all for all the kind words that have been said about Norway. And I think maybe, if I'm allowed to do so, I would like to say a little bit about how I see some of the challenges we are facing right now. As most of you will know, the Prime Minister of Norway launched the Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative in Bali at the COP in 2007 with the goal of scaling up our financing through the Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative up to $500 million US. And I'm happy to say that we will reach that goal next year. And as you said, Tim, we'll be very happy if other countries will increase beyond that. But that said, I should also say, of course, that many other countries are very actively involved in REDD Plus financing, and we are grateful to work with them and with forest countries. So I think if I may, to maybe have a little bit of a political frame work to how I see the world right now, and start off with 4 points that we think is essential to our success on this issue. First, very obviously, that REDD Plus must be a core part of the post-2020 framework. Second, we must scale up REDD Plus financing significantly before 2020. Third, this is likely to require us to do things on REDD+ differently than we do today. And lastly, we must remember why it was possible to scale up the financing and the core idea of REDD+, and that is the concept of payment for emissions reductions with strong safeguards, ensuring that emission reductions can be measured, reported, and verified, and scaling up demand for verified emissions reductions. On the first point, I don't think I need to elaborate on that. REDD+ finance must be, as I said, a core element in the global deal we agree by 2015 and implement from 2020. But 2020 obviously won't do it for REDD+. While UNEP efforts towards 2015 and 2020 are important, we must not let those efforts make us complacent about what we do in the short and medium term. You will be aware that UNEP recently adjusted upwards their estimate of the mitigation gap between now and 2020. With full implementation of the Copenhagen and Cancun pledges, we still will be 9 billion tons per year short by 2020 to have a likely chance of meeting the 2-degree target. On current trajectories, 2 degrees will be gone by 2020, and we will, if science is our guide, find ourselves in a very different world, where our opportunities for controlling climate change will be severely constrained, and its cost, in any case, having risen dramatically. We have, and it's important, I think, as we look at the long term, and I agree fully that we need to look at the long term, but that in the next few years, maybe our last chance, by taking the actions needed to ensure that we still have a shot at the 2-degree goal by 2020. And it's our strong belief that REDD+ will be an essential factor in this context, and we must greatly step up our efforts to finance REDD+ in the years up to 2020. We need also, I think, to factor in the risk of inaction as well as risk of action, and start acting and reducing emissions now rather than just planning for reducing emissions. This will require large and predictable finance, so today's topic, closing the REDD+ finance gap, is hugely important. REDD+ is a long-term development choice, and I look forward to what my friend Pakero has to say on this issue. Our support for it must reflect that fact. REDD+ finance must be adequate and predictable. This is harder than it sounds. Official development aid, the way it's traditionally practiced, is simply not suited for all such support. While tailored for the capacity building, the so-called readiness phase is far less suitable for handling the paying for verified emissions reductions over time. So we need to look beyond traditional ODA, including in the pre-2020 period, that will, especially in this financially challenging time, require significant creativity and political will. I think that there's still very strong political support in most countries for the reasons we all know to support REDD+. And of course, because of the range of additional benefits of REDD+ implementation beyond reducing emissions. I think where we disagree is on how to deal with these insights. In our review, while we have made good progress on REDD+ conceptually in the negotiations, there are several challenges we need to face if we're going to be able to scale up the financing over the next decade. While it's increasingly recognized that reducing deforestation brings tremendous opportunities for green growth, and that there is an indisputable element of self-interest, at least in the medium to long run, there are short-term political and economic trade-offs in taking action. Brazil has shown that deforestation can be reduced quickly and significantly. It's extremely impressive what Brazil has been able to do, a 70+% reduction over the last few years, and 8 years ahead of their 2020 goal of 80% reduction. Well, at the same time, they have been able to increase their agricultural output. but it took political will. So a price signal on forest carbon is needed to help other countries with less capacity to implement what Brazil has been doing. And right now, there is no such signal, and the people working hard on REDD plus readiness around the world struggle to get the traction needed from their political leaders. A lot of good things happened in Durban. A lot of progress was made, but in a sense, it also created a policy vacuum, where the global deal that would generate large and predictable demand for verified emissions reductions from REDD Plus has been postponed until 2020. And no national or regional climate legislation stepped in to fill that gap. And this is our main task in the years to come as policymakers. And Norway will continue to do its part. We will continue our efforts, but it will require more than fast start pledges. I would also like to just say that on a national level, it's very obvious that REDD Plus must be more about more than carbon about carbon. But at the same time, as we look at international cooperation, it's important to remind ourselves, as I said in the beginning, our dual-track approach of paying for verified emissions reductions while adhering to strictly to strong social and environmental safeguards. I'd like to bring up one more issue which concerns me greatly here in Doha, and that's the resistance of some parties to verification of emissions reductions. And this is hugely important when you look at the financing of REDD Plus. Basically, in my view, it's a non-starter. Without this fundamental component, the global initiative incentive structure that is the core of REDD Plus is simply gone. And so in this business-type transaction between developed and developing countries, we have a huge challenge if we try to put that issue aside. If we are to generate the kind of finance we need to help drive a global land use transformation, the international community will have to see verifiable results. And this is irrespective of how REDD Plus will be financed. Let me then just conclude by saying that it's sometimes easy, especially here in Doha, to be comfortable in our thinking about where we're going to be in the long term. And I think that is absolutely necessary for us to do so. But at the same time, we must remind ourselves of the fact that time is very short. What is agreed and implemented on REDD Plus actions and finance before 2020 could have a decisive impact on our planet's future. So, at the same time as we talk about the challenges now, I think it's important that we don't complicate things more than we absolutely have to. They're complicated enough as they are. And that we are pragmatic on pursuing all financing options that can generate demand for verified emissions reductions. And I look forward to hearing your views. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Hans, for that very clear message, and also for your call to be pragmatic. I think this is a call that was echoed in several of the other sessions, that we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we cannot be afraid of some learning by doing. And in terms of keeping the eye on the ball and the overall goal in mind that we have to close this finance gap, just one word on the perspective, and Don Kanak will say a little bit more about that. The emissions gap, if we assume, is 30 billion per year or somewhere around that, in a $70 trillion annual global economy, that is 0.04% of that annual global economy. We heard this morning that we have two key planetary boundaries, climate change and biodiversity. Forests are at the heart of both of those. So if we lived in a slightly more rational world, I think everybody would agree that this is essential to make that investment. With that, I would like to lead over to Don Kanak, who is a senior fellow at the Harvard Law School program on international financial systems. He's also chairman of Prudential Corporation Asia, and he's the founder of Forest Solutions, a US company formed to advise, invest in, or support projects or ideas that demonstrate sustainable forest management. I found out yesterday that he's actually come here on his private ticket, so this seems to be his hobby, and he's very enthusiastic about making impacts in this linkage between the world of finance and the world of forestry. So we're very happy to have him here. He also organized 2 forest carbon finance summits in Washington, D.C., so looking forward to his insights on closing the finance gap. Please, Don.
Thank you, Tim. I guess that description proves that I'm sort of an odd duck in the sense that I'm supposed to be representing or talk about the private sector financial or institutional investor perspective. But there is this other history that I have, having started my life as a environmental or conservation NGO person with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. But then I took a big detour and have spent the last 25 years in Asia in the insurance and asset management business as my paying job. And if those of you, how many people do we have from Asia in this meeting today? Anybody who lives and works any part of Asia, you've seen over the last 25 years an extraordinary economic and financial miracle. But if you've also been part of that, you know that there is a massive environmental price and a big challenge that we face in continuing that growth, but making sure that it's sustainable. And so about 6 years ago, I started doing the various things that Tim described, including chairing a global project for WWF in this area. And we tried to bridge this financing gap, and I would describe it as 2 gaps. 2 gaps. One is the money gap. You've already said, 30 billion, 17 billion of annual revenues. There are various numbers out there versus a few hundred million of annual flows today. That's the money gap. And the money gap, if you look at it as a big number like that, if you look at it in the context of the other big numbers of the global economy, or there's a study out recently that by 2015, the global trade in forest-related products will be $1.2 trillion a year. So these numbers of 30 billion or more, 50 billion a year, relative to any of the global economic numbers are not that big. But it's still big relative to where we are today. And so you say, well, many people have been saying in lots of meetings, high-level meetings, medium-level meetings, and low-level meetings, that the private sector has a big role to play. The last time I attended a forest day, to confess, was in Copenhagen in 2009. And at that time, this room probably would have had a whole lot more people participating from the private sector financial institutions. There were a lot of expectations in many areas, not just in finance, but that the private sector would be playing a bigger role. But we know today that hasn't materialized. The voluntary carbon markets are a tiny fraction of that $30 billion number. That's not going to really move the meter at all. The European carbon markets are closed to forest carbon. The US didn't develop a national forest carbon market. California is about to start one, but if you probably size the amount that could go for international forest efforts, it's not going to be big enough to move the meter. So in that sense, the private sector the role didn't materialize that some people were calling for or expecting. And if we go beyond carbon, I think the point's going to be made one after another today in this discussion that it's not just about carbon. If we go to other natural capital, other environmental services or payments for those, that's even more at the infancy. So today, the private sector just hasn't really materialized major financing. That's the money gap. And I think to solve that, one of the things that just jumps out to me as I'm passing between the private sector and the NGO world or the policy world is, I will call it, how do we close the perspective gap? I mean, I've had 1,000 discussions with people over the last 6 years that start with the phrase, I am a blank, I don't know anything about blank. I am a biologist, I don't know anything about REDD. I am a finance minister, I don't know anything about forestry. I am a banker. I don't know anything about trees. And so what you have, you're starting from these very, very different perspectives, and we could probably have that conversation about 200 times in this room, where people know what they know. They're smart, they're passionate, they're working hard, but they just don't know enough about the other perspectives. And I saw the value of putting those perspectives together in these two forest finance summits that we put together in Washington in 2009, 2010, where we locked in a room, more than one room, 120 people, and broke into groups, and from Friday night until Sunday lunch, eating together, studying together, arguing, trying to come to narrowing this perspective gap of how to make financing happen in a way that was good for forests, good for people, good for biodiversity, and responsible in terms of investment. And I saw that gap come together, but then on Monday morning, everybody went back to their silos, right? We all went back to being bear scientists and bankers and policymakers, and I see those gaps still aren't closing enough. So I compliment CIFOR, Jeff, any of the organizations that can continue to put those perspectives together, and hopefully longer than 1.5 hours in a meeting. I think it takes more time, but I think if we can close the perspectives and build a better atmosphere of trust, this will work. So I think I have to say that about the gap. I don't think you can close the money gap without closing that other gap. In terms of what are investors, or let's just say, what are long-term investors, big institutions, responsible capital, looking for and investing in climate solutions? That's, to me, the important question. If you're talking about, we're not talking about small-scale speculative capital. We're talking about the large capital. The world's in-force amount of bonds is $91 trillion. There's $54 trillion in the insurance and pension management industries. How does that capital look at investing in climate solutions? Last year, I was fortunate to work with a group of people chairing what's called a Global Agenda Council at the World Economic Forum on insurance and asset management. And I had a great vice chair who also shared this passion for climate and environment and conservation. And we focused a lot of that effort on trying to define the prerequisites for unlocking this very large pool, the 54 trillion. What would the prerequisites be to really unlock that for climate solutions? And we put out a statement, and if you really think about it, it's what you would expect. These institutions are not investing their own money, so to speak. They're fiduciaries. We're fiduciaries. We are investing other people's money. We're investing pension funds. We're investing policyholders' money, investing shareholders' money. It has to be done with a clear understanding of rules, of the projections of revenue, predictability of regulations and policy, and the expectation that the risk can be quantified. And then funds can flow. And so a predictable macro policy environment was probably the first and foremost thing. The creation of the Green Climate Fund is really an important aspect of clarifying that the public finance is going to be there and is going to be leading. There was a call to rapidly grow climate bonds as a category of investment that could become a major category for investment that could be considered by institutional investors as high quality investment. That could unlock other. I won't go into there were 4 or 5 other recommendations, but you get the sense that we're talking about long-term, stable policy can lead to long-term, large-scale investment. The past several years, the private sector, institutional finance, has been active in climate investing or climate-related investing. I mean, there have been billions, hundreds of billions, going into renewable energy, into changing national energy grids, into wind and solar, into energy efficiency. It's not as though the private sector isn't participating in the overall solution. The question is, though, what has enabled that, and what's missing from the REDD plus equation? Because it hasn't happened in REDD plus. Things like feed-in tariffs, things like a demand for the things that are produced in the case of renewable energy. There's a real economy demand for that energy. How to create that real long-term demand for low carbon sustainable development products and growth opportunities in forest communities that would make REDD finance flourish. That, I think, that's the crux of what we need to discuss to talk about how to make the private sector long-term institutional finance flow into this area. And finally, I would just say that while we're waiting for that long-term clarity, maybe we could spend a little bit of time hopefully discussing some interim things that could be done to try to get things moving. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. I especially like this view of the perspective gap, because that is certainly something that we can do something about fairly quickly, and I hope that your optimism is justified that that will somehow ease the closing of the finance gap. We now move to one of our speakers who represents a private sector company that is already doing something. Thierry Novacek is the Product Environment Manager at Airbus. He was appointed to that position in November 2011, and in that role, Thierry is in charge of environmental issues and policies impacting Airbus products, as well as representing Airbus in various aerospace international panels and bodies. In his previous role, he was responsible for the Airbus Environment Reduction Plan, a project setting strong objectives to reduce the impact of Airbus manufacturing by 2020. And I used to work for IUCN, so I also know that Airbus is playing a large role in the bond challenge to restore 150 million hectares of degraded land. So I assume you also could have been sitting next door on the panel with Bianca Jagger, but you chose to be here with us instead, so we highly appreciate that. Please, Thierry, the floor is yours.
So first of all, I'm warmly thanks IUCN and UNEP for inviting Airbus today. I totally agree with Donald. I know nothing about tree, and I need to explain you why Airbus is today in a forest day. So first of all, you have to know that the industry as a whole, meaning the aircraft manufacturer, but the airline, the airport, and the air navigation service provider has come together to define a very ambitious roadmap. Setting the first objective is to have a carbon neutral growth by 2020 to cap net the emission, the CO2 emission, and then by 2050 to halve the emission based on 2005. And regarding the first stage, we assess that 60 to 70% of the efficiency will come from new technology and the development of new aircraft, and it's what we do in Airbus, and we are confident we will do it. But you have other levers in this roadmap. You have the air traffic management, and you have the development of alternative fuel for aviation. So why alternative fuel for aviation? It's because when you think about new energy for aviation, the other type of energy such as hydrogen or electricity are not mature enough. So in a short to mid-term, if you cannot change the engine, you change the fuel. And it's what we do since 2008. We're deeply involved in the certification process, in flight test, and within our customer, we have performed more than 1,500 commercial flights with passenger on board, with biofuel. And now today we have a leadership and a coordination role in the creation of what we call alternative fuel value chain that gather the farmer, the refinery, and the end customer, the airline. We assess the sustainability and the life cycle assessment within an independent university, and we fulfill all the criteria from the Roundtable for Sustainable Biofuel, which is a worldwide recognized body in this matter. So in fact, our ambition is to now be catalyzed solution for alternative fuel in a commercial quantity without competing with land, water, and food resources. So coming back to, as you mentioned, IUCN, in fact, we are doing everything we can to tackle the 2% of CO2 emission from the aviation industry. Nevertheless, we also support those who are tackling the over 98%, including the 20% or 50% of deforestation. So that's why in 2011, since 2011, we are supporting the Bond Challenge, and we have created the project Plant a Pledge in partnership with IUCN. because we believe it's a practical manner to tackle emission and to address other issues such as social and economy. And from this relationship with IUCN, in fact, we discovered that some of our value chain could be accountable for land restoration. And I can give you later on some example. So we really identify here a synergy between two different objectives. Yeah? We can provide technical expertise, commercial knowledge, and IUCN provides us the sustainable and landscape restoration and a wider environmental framework. But personally, I don't know anything about REDD, you know. So hopefully they are there. So now we are really developing this win-win opportunity, and we are about to launch another project in partnership with IUCN and also in partnership with our sister company Astrium that provides satellite capability for identification and monitoring. We are so about to develop the feasibility study to develop on a larger scale a biofuel for aviation in the framework of landscape restoration in Africa and in North America. So in a nutshell, let's say Airbus believe its landscape restoration is a very promising and a practical way to achieve our industry goals. That's why we are here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and we'll be coming back to some of the points that Thierry raised in the discussion, I'm sure. I would now like to move on to our friend and colleague Pakeo Prasetyo from Indonesia. He is a member of the President's National REDD Plus Task Force. He's the Deputy One for Planning and International Relations. And prior to that position, he was Director for International Relations of the Executing Agency for Reconstruction and Rehabilitation for ASEAN and NIAS. And he also has extensive private sector experience, having worked over 15 years as in a consulting firm and serving as country managing director for Accenture in Indonesia. Pakeo, I was very happy that you agreed to join us here, and as we talked before, I wanted to give you the last word in this to show how all of these issues that were raised come together in Indonesia, because Indonesia clearly is a country where all challenges that were discussed today at Forest Day are present at a massive scale, but the opportunities are equally large, especially now that the president has made a green economy transition a flagship initiative. So, Pakeo, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim. It was a very heavy introduction of myself, so the burden is on my shoulder in terms of trying to match that. Well, actually, what I'd like to share with you is not so much about the source, not so much about the use, but about the supply chain of finance from that perspective. And I would like to actually see this on the basis of the experience that we have when $7.2 billion flow into Aceh in 4 years. Normally in a kind of situation like that, 15 to 50% of the pledge was converted into real program, into real disbursement. In the case of the Aceh case, it was 104%. So there is a significant difference that I believe there are some lessons that we can learn from that flow. Now let me shift a bit in terms of my thought when we are talking about the REDD Plus financing, particularly from the part on the public financing before moving into the private investment side of it. When on the 26th of May 2010, the letter of intent is signed between Indonesia and Norway, then the REDD Plus have some money numbers put into that. I think that number was $1 billion, as everybody knows, and that is pay for performance basically at the end of that process. The thinking that we have at that time is that as part of the letter of intent as well, is that we need to create a financial or funding funding instrument, all right, a financial instrument that will make this happen. It was not an easy discussion on that part because the perception will need to have these two very important elements that if we link with that kind of funding for the disaster is also applied. And that's number one, is there any shared vision? When I say that 7.2 billion US dollars fund that is spent on Aceh, it's not government money alone, it's the people's money. The IFRC said 67% of the fund, or 1.1 billion US dollars they throw in, was actually the pops and moms' money, like $5 each. So it's really the sentiment of the people to the people. Shared vision is in terms that we need to get out of this misery. Okay? But then, not only that, the other part of that is very important is trust. You can actually make a very big pledge, but it will never happen to be consumed, it will never be to disperse, if the trust is not there. Because the trust needs to be earned. Trust needs to be established in that relationship as a partner. So, trust and shared value, which in this case, actually talking about what Don mentioned about the perspective gap, is what is very important to have. Because how can you have a shared value if your perspective is still having a big gap? So you need to have that perspective get narrowed. So that is where we feel very, very honored and also having a high pleasure that Norway, when talking to us, have that shared value clear and also but the perspective gap slowly shortened and narrowed and for discussion, because it's not something that is negotiated. This is something that is a partnership way of getting it inside. Now, when you already have that shared value and the perspective, the trust into that, then what needs to happen on the value chain and the supply chain of the fund? The first one is that the operation on the host side, all right? I will say that the home side of the fund and the host side of the fund and the interim side in the middle, on the host side, there is a need, a very strong need, that the effort and the operation is true to purpose. Because if we are talking about let's go and go somewhere else from the REDD plus perspective, narrow perspective gap, the gap will be widened, and that is something that is eroding trust. So this is a situation that we are facing. So true to purpose in the operation of the host country is very important. The second point that needs to happen there is that it's moving in the right speed. All right, you can move very fast, but then you get into a trouble because that you get very difficult in controlling the true to purpose element. So the right speed is very important. How do we ensure that it's right, the speed is right? Again, the partnership needs to work. All right, so that the perspective gap and the right speed is being discussed as well. As well, to be agreed, is basically the flexibility of the use of the fund. You see, when you're talking about REDD Plus, the position here is that a lot of the discussion, or not a lot of the work that needs to happen in the front, is basically enabling conditions. That enabling condition is very unpredictable. What is it? If the country has a very lousy information and data integrity, you need to correct that first. And then next is that your regulation is not there. There are a lot of REDD Plus ecosystem restoration program in Indonesia that fall flat in its face. And the reason for that is because of the regulation is not there, and the institution that makes that work is not there as well. So there are institutions that needs to be built, there are a regulation that needs to be changed. And that flexibility of the first part of the fund needs to be agreed, both by the host country and the home country for the implementation of that. The fourth one is accountability and transparency. And accountability and transparency is definitely, I don't have to clarify and don't have to make a long discussion about that because that's very clear. Without accountability and transparency, trust will not be there. And then after that, once you are already doing the preparation and moving into the action per se, then you need to have the thematic, legal, and institutional framework. A lot of situation is that, all right, let's do it through our business as usual institution, and your business as usual institution is not yet trustable because it was formed using a lot of regulation of the past that is not addressing the current issue. So you need to have that as well. So it seems that this is something that, how do we reflect? Does it happen in the case of Nias and Aceh reconstruction? 7.2 billion US dollars is just an amount. In 4 years' time, from a very heavily devastated area, the whole world, 50 countries together with 550 NGOs, built the land together. So the effort is actually a world class and a world performance, not a government of Indonesia performance. Can we think the same thing? Can we say the same thing about REDD+? Can it be a world performance? Can it be something that is actually shared? And the government of Indonesia cannot say, this is my work, this is my performance. No, it's not the performance of the government of Indonesia alone. It's that if we can do that, if we can be in that position, then the supply chain of the finance is actually open for that. Now, our financial system for funding instrument that we created, which is called the Funding for REDD+ in Indonesia, or called REDD, is actually designed with that principles in mind. So we designed that principle with the principles in mind, and we put that into a 3-channel: the public fund, the private investment, as well as the market facilitation fund. So the characteristic of each will be different. What I mentioned earlier is a general characteristic for the public fund, but when it gets to financial investment or the private investment, then you need to create what is the return from that product or that investment that we are putting in REDD+. Well, definitely people are talking about carbon, and carbon will definitely be cardinal in terms of making it happen. But then if carbon is already something that we're saying is going to be the return, but people in UNFCCC and all our discussion is still not very firm. What is that carbon? Where is this market? How can it happen? What will be the fallback position? What will be the secondary product? What will be the co-product that can be offered? And that is something that we may actually talk about, that low emission related products. You have timber with a low emission, you're talking about palm oil with a low emission, and those low emission is actually the additional value that may justify the investment that is put into the activity that is REDD+ related through this channel. So the channel needs to have the characteristic I mentioned, but at the end of the day, you need to have the return, and the return comes from the difference of the price that is earned, not only on carbon, but also on the other products and other services coming out. One of the problems that we all realize that putting the value to natural asset, putting the value to the output of the natural asset is still a big question mark. And that is something that the regulation and the institution that is being formed needs to address as well. So basically, we have this kind of setup in REDD, and we will be able to prove that it is working properly or not. You're moving to the next step, and you're talking about time, you're talking about the right speed. I believe that this partnership will last and make to the real next stage, whereby we're talking about pay for performance, but with one condition: the shared value and the trust will still be there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Heru, for framing REDD+ as a world performance. I think that is a very appropriate term, and also thank you for reminding us that Indonesia has faced formidable challenges that it has overcome. So REDD+, I'm sure, can also be successfully implemented in Indonesia and in other countries. We have about 20 minutes now for questions and answers. I'm very keen to give the floor to the audience. As just one little question I would like to pose first, drawing a little bit more on Naoko's experience in the finance ministry, and perhaps she could tell us a little bit more about elements of a possible portfolio of funding options. I think it's become clear that there is no, at least in the medium or short term, there's no one single funding source to close the finance gap. But what could a possible portfolio of funding look like?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think that several speakers already mentioned that we need to actually draw attention to that all range of the services that Forestry is providing. So that people already mentioned that the PES and the payment for the ecosystem services, and somebody mentioned that the importance of certification system and the water fund. These are actually already, in a sense, the mechanism in place, but we are not really creating the comprehensive environment that to achieve the scale. So we are a bit of struggling at actually that Jeff, that how to create a more comprehensive and also enforceable framework under which I fully understand that putting the natural capital is very, very difficult. It's not a kind of natural thing, but we need to find a way to create that kind of comprehensive framework under which that those kind of services can be traded and transacted and being put in a transaction, and also the progress being measured based on that framework. In terms of the PPP, that is another struggle, actually, that we have been working very strongly, persistently, that how to make it work. And so far, our experience has been not necessarily too great. I think there are two elements in it, and how to make this PPP works better. First of all, as we all admit, that without really putting prices in a comprehensive way, this policy environment is not really sufficiently conducive to the private sector to really jump in. So what we have been doing a bit of that success case in isolation, how to make those success cases to replicate in another occasion. We have been several good cases here and there, but because of the policy environment, it's so different from technology to technology, product to product, country to country. It's so difficult to really just replicate that one success case to everywhere. So that without having that kind of environment of the putting prices in natural capital, I think our struggle of trying to replicate those success cases into the other areas will continue, and that's something that we continue to do. Just taking the opportunity about this perspective gap that kindly you mentioned that Jeff or other institutions should do more to close that perspective gap. Actually, that's one thing that Jeff really want to do, to try to utilize this convening power to put every ministry, the private sector, the public sector together, but without having that incentive structure, the price signal, the policy signal, and information signal. It's quite difficult to get people and act together. So that again, as you said, on the Monday morning, we will all go back and work this in silo mode. So again, I just want to emphasize one more time to create a kind of comprehensive system. It's so important. It seems that's key to go. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Naoko. I think we're all very fortunate that you're bringing that perspective and experience into the GEF, and we look forward to how that will be reflected in the sixth replenishment period. I would now like to open the floor for questions. Please state briefly who you are and keep your questions short so we can give the floor to as many colleagues as possible. There's a roving mic here. We'll start in the middle there, and then afterwards the gentleman behind you, and then we come to the front. Please.
Hello, thank you. I appreciate the panelists to enlighten us this financing mechanism and for REDD. I really appreciate Norwegian to very clearly stating about the REDD plus, and we have to decide it. So my question is, we well know since this morning we are talking about landscape, ecosystem, or watershed-based approaches. And then for those things, we all know that forest has to do a lot. For instance, forest is providing water for hydropower, for drinking water, for irrigational water. So how about mobilizing internally some kind of mechanism the users should pay back to the forest. For instance, hydropower generated from some watershed, how about some levy to the user of electricity to pay back the forest? Similarly, drinking water. For instance, in Kenya, there are 5 water towers, they are saying. Similarly, in Accra, there is Ativa forest in Ghana. So, is there any mechanism like investor, like World Bank or other bilateral multilateral donor? Sorry, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. If you could just pass the microphone behind you there to Faisal Parish.
Thank you. I'm Faisal Parish, Global Environment Center from Malaysia. 2 specific questions. Dr. Ishii, I support the various points you made at the beginning about multiple value of forests, better coordination of finance, strengthened capacity, and public-private partnerships, and long-term approach. I'd like to ask you if you could elaborate a little further on the coordination of the existing funds, especially the many climate change-related funding mechanisms which have been established, and how to have a better synergistic approach and getting more collective resources raised and dispersed. Secondly, Ambassador Hans Bratzer or Donald, how to get the government or pension funds really to invest to support the REDD Plus vision and invest in transformational change for forest management rather than continuing to invest in climate and in projects and activities which have a negative impact on climate and forestry. So how do we make that transformation for government funds? For example, Norway, I understand, has a very large government investment portfolio, and globally the pension funds, they could be the major source of additional funds for the financing gap. So how do we mobilize them? Thank you.
Thank you. If you could pass the microphone here to the 3rd row on the side there. To Arild Angelsen.
Arild Angelsen, as you say, CIFOR and Norwegian University of Life Science. I think it's very good that we keep 2 thoughts in our head. I'm very glad that the GEF director also said that we are talking about financing, but also about policies. And at times, quite often actually, we think that it's higher spending that is going to save the forest, and we forget the policies, and that the whole idea of REDD was to change the policies. For example, the reasons behind the large reduction of deforestation in Brazil is better enforcement of existing laws. It's removal of agricultural subsidies that at least saves the government budgets for money and perhaps the economy, or probably the economy as well. And that we have a lot of relatively cheap options also to reduce emissions. So this spending approach, I think, is important to keep it in mind, to have these both thoughts. So that was more comment. I have also, we heard about the gap here, and it's also a perception gap. But there is also a 3rd gap. There is a disbursement gap, and it's kind of a paradoxical situation that for the short term there is a disbursement gap, that the money committed, agencies are struggling to find good uses in the short term, and also the expectation gap that many countries and villagers expect the REDD money to flow in quickly. And the paradox is that, okay, those money have been provided by my governments and others, but it's hard to find them to use. So if some of you would like to comment on that, if that is not just something temporary and it will be disappearing in a year or 2, or what we can do to also address that, because it is important for the expectation gap that we are experiencing, that people and countries want to see some immediate benefits from REDD.
Thank you very much. We'll take one more question over here, and then we'll pass for a round of, just here at the front, no, the lady here, at least some gender balance also.
Sorry, thanks. Hi, my name is Molly Stanley. I work for Forest Trends in Washington, D.C. Forest Trends has sort of a dual role in that we track REDD Plus from the top down, and then also REDD Plus project level activities coming from the bottom up. And in 2011, we tracked millions of dollars going into forest carbon project level activities that rivaled the amount of money coming out of programs like the FCPF, representing private sector dollars that impact hundreds of projects, hundreds of stakeholders, tens of thousands of people on the ground who are directly engaged with these projects. when we talk about activities that will fill the gap and sources of potential finance, projects tend to be glanced over. And I don't want to sound like a cheerleader, so what I'd like to know is your take on project level finance as a potential solution within the portfolio of opportunities.
Thank you very much. I think that was quite a rich and interesting series of questions, starting from payment for ecosystem services and how that could be scaled up for forests, and then moving to how the existing funds could be better coordinated, to how the pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, which indeed are managing vast amounts of money, could be interested in becoming a driver for REDD+. We had a question about the finance versus the policy gap and how to create long-term and predictable benefits and not necessarily only financial benefits. And then finally, one of the sensitive issues also at the negotiations, what is the project level and the experience we can generate from that versus the national level? Now, I'll give the floor to each of the panelists. If I can ask you to answer in soundbite style, both for the benefit of our media and blog colleagues here, but also because we're now running short of time. We'll give Jane 5 minutes at the end to summarize this very rich discussion. So if I could start with Pak Heru and brief reflections perhaps towards the project versus national level, because I think also in Indonesia there's quite good experience with both.
Thank you. In Indonesia, there is about 45, or maybe more than that, demonstration activity and projects that relates to REDD+. Even before, or perhaps REDD, maybe not REDD+, even before the task force of REDD+ was formed. There are a lot of lessons that is learned from that, but as the first speaker mentioned, the problem of the different technology, the problem of the different approaches, make it very difficult to learn from each other and integrate into something that is solid. By way of that, if you want to see that's a full cycle REDD+ project, whereby you are doing something, reduce emission, measure in the front, get the measure at the end, and then claim some pay for performance on that, none is there yet. Okay, so the full cycle is not there yet. And basically what the projects are things that is called the enabling condition kind of preparation. So maybe you're testing and start doing some planting of trees, you're doing some sort of a damming of the peatland, foundations for getting into the real results. And still struggling in FPIC, for instance, there are a lot of things that needs to be happening, but it's not happening as yet. So I will say that at this moment, you're talking about project financing, the risk is in terms of the perception gap, that your project financing today is basically not going to produce emission reduction right away. I also mentioned about the problem from the government side when the regulation is not prepared for that. Ecosystem restoration projects. The government regulation is not supportive of that as yet. And the institution that needs to make that happen is not established properly as yet. So there are a lot of those, the enabling condition that needs to happen up front. We need to be very careful not to be jumping into immediate results and expecting that quickly, because the problem that may result of that is a social conflict. When our tenurial issue is not resolved yet, and you have this ecosystem restoration project coming in, and suddenly the people on the ground will say, what? I am not supposed to do anything anymore in the land that I am living in for so long already, then you create conflict, and that is not what we want as well. So those are the condition that needs to happen to make a real REDD project alive, and those are not easy to achieve. So I think it's not yet the time to demand for a full cycle REDD+ project coming out with result of emission reduction at this moment.
Thank you very much, Pakero. I'm tempted to give the question on the sovereign wealth funds and pension funds to Hans, just because Norway has one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. I don't know if there's much to be said on it, but I would then afterwards give the floor to Dawn about the payment for system service potential, and then there was a question for better coordination of existing funds, which I would pass to Naoko. So Hans, I don't know if you want to tackle that one. Otherwise, just pass it back to me.
Well, yeah, I'll be very excited to hear what you have to say. I should just pass it back to you, but maybe if I can just touch on a few of the issues here, since I probably will only have this one opportunity to do so. And I just want to say again, when we talk about risk and engaging the private sector, I think again it's important to remember that not creating demand for verified emissions reductions before 2020, that's our greatest risk. So let's keep that challenge in mind, and not implementing REDD Plus at scale in the next few years. That's a huge risk. I think as far as encouraging sovereign funds or the private sector to go strongly into investments that we would like to see, it's again to stick to what we have already agreed on around REDD Plus decisions. And one is strong social and environmental safeguards. And here you can see in the private sector, in the volunteer market, that things are already happening in that sense. That's very positive. Let's not forget that. But strong social and environmental safeguards, and through full transparency. And I go back to the issue of MRV. Every stakeholder, including private business, needs to know and be able to see what's happening and to review what's going on. Let me mention the Consumer Goods Forum that many of you know about, and others need to know what is happening at every step of their supply chain. And the same thing is true for REDD Plus investments. And Professor Angelsen talked about the expectation gap, and let me say that it's at two levels. One is at the government level, where a lot of countries are asking again and again, where is this funding coming from in the next few years? And I think there's a very heavy responsibility on all of us representing the wealthy part of the world to deliver on that issue. At the same time, we must be able to show on the ground some positive results and something that can in a meaningful way explain REDD Plus to everyone. And through the Norwegian Climate and Forest Fund, we have a program about $35 million for research, for gaining knowledge, but also for experimenting in these kind of practical experiences where NGOs and others do gain that kind of experience on the ground, and to see how we can show people that REDD Plus can work for everyone in their daily lives. But at the same time, as we gain this experience, again, and then back to the project level funding, from our point of view, it's been a guiding principle from the beginning that we need to learn from practical experience, but at the same time, we need to have a national approach to REDD. And as soon as possible, all these different projects we do at the local level, or regional level, or provincial level, or whatever it might be, they have to fit into a national approach to REDD. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's going to be another bunch of good or bad programs that we have, or projects we have over time. There will be leakage. We will gain a lot of experience. The deforestation will continue, and the emission levels will continue to rise. So we need a national approach to REDD Plus.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pass the floor to Dawn, and please, we're now running quite close to the end of the session, so very brief. And of course, you can reflect on any other of the questions, but the one on payment for ecosystem services, I think, has not received an answer yet.
I'm going to disappoint you, Tim. I'm going to do what the ambassador just did very quickly, but I'll do it in sound bites if I could. On the project versus national, I'm 100% in agreement with what Ambassador Bratskar said, that projects are great laboratories for learning as far as scaling up to transformational change for the climate or for biodiversity or any of the other good things that could come from REDD. I have serious doubts about projects as the way to go, but I do think there's a lot of good learning going on there. Second soundbite, disbursement gap. We didn't kind of discuss that issue. I'm not going to jump in the middle of the disbursement gap between those who are dispersing or not dispersing and whoever's the dispersee. But from the private sector perspective, the private sector is very observant. If we're talking about public-private partnerships with long-term implications where the public is supposed to play a role, if the public isn't dispersing according to the current things it's doing, the private sector is probably going to be wondering, are they going to disperse in an orderly way, and how do you ensure that as part of the certainty question that the private sector needs to think about before it can jump into a very long-term investment. Third thing, pension funds. I addressed that a little bit earlier, but the thing the ambassador touched on this a little bit, but I think the elephant we did not get to in the room is the question about long-term demand. That most of the programs that exist today exist for 1, 3, 5 years of funding. And the question we're asking forest communities, forest countries to make a commitment to permanence of land use. That's decades, that's generations. There is no long-term counterparty, long-term entity that can make a deal for 20, 30, 50 years. But yet we're expecting that kind of commitment the other way, and we'll be looking for financing that way. So I think the long-term demand question, whether that comes through VERs, as was mentioned, or whether that comes through some sort of embedded subsidy in sustainable products, but there needs to be this area of the AMC, the advanced market commitment, needs to be dealt with, and we need some sort of facility that would enable that that would be at a scale, 3, 5 billions of dollars that could make those kind of long-term commitments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being brief also, and for highlighting some very important points. I'd like to give the chance also to Thierry to give us some reflections as we move towards closing of our session before I give the floor to Naoko, and then Jane Feehan will give us a short rundown of some of the key points. Thierry.
Well, thank you. It's very open ground you give me. But I really like what you say, the long-term investment. And I think we perfectly know what it is in Airbus, because the life cycle of our product is about 40 years, including the developments. And so I can give you a practical example, as I said before, of what we do in terms of value chain and the value chain that we believe could be accountable for landscape restoration. For example, in Romania, we developed a value chain on very polluted land, which was polluted land by heavy industry in the last century. And here, nothing can grow, and if you hit anything there, you just die, okay? So the concept here is to grow camelina, by literally pumping the pollution, and then during the refinery process, you segregate the heavy metal from the biofuel, okay? And this is, we believe, accountable for landscape restoration, and we are working with IUCN to assess this. Another example is in Brazil. We have a very big project here in partnership with TAM, the Brazilian airline. The intention is to produce a quarter of the annual fuel consumption of TAM. Here we are using degraded land due to overcattling. And within a rotation system, we are growing jatropha, which is a small tree, and using the fruit of the jatropha to produce a biofuel. And so it's an additional income for the farmer, leads to biofuel production, and also it's a landscape restoration. So this is the practical manner we are tackling the issue. Yeah.